The last days of the war had left the Bavarian countryside bruised, under a sky the color of old iron, and the scattered remnants of the collapsing Reich moved like ghosts through the wounded villages. Among them was Dr. Albrecht Voss, a physicist whose name never appeared in official rosters, whose assignments were sealed beneath layers of disappearing paper, and whose presence inside the collapsing Nazi scientific apparatus was known only to a handful of officers who would not live to describe him. He walked with a battered satchel pressed to his chest, as if the leather itself contained the last fragment of his identity, and those who glimpsed him during those final weeks remembered nothing except the tension in his eyes, that permanent flinch as though he expected someone to recognize him and drag him back into the dark halls he had fled. The surrender in early May should have brought him relief, but instead it loosened the final restraints on the fear that had knotted itself into his spine, because now there were no superiors to protect him, no structures left to contain the secrets he had carried through the war. The Allies advanced through the surrounding forests, setting up makeshift headquarters inside half-intact barns and commandeered farmhouses, and Voss drifted along the edges of these new frontiers, like a man trying to erase himself before anyone could ask where he had come from. He found temporary shelter in an abandoned monastery perched above a bomb-shaken valley. Its stone walls were cracked, but still held their shape, and a cold draught flowed through the vacant corridors like a displaced spirit. Voss chose a narrow chamber overlooking the ravine, setting his satchel on the floor as though it were a sleeping animal that might wake if disturbed. The air carried the faint smell of wet ash. Broken candles lay scattered on the stone, and on some forgotten surface, someone had carved the outline of a bird with a blade. The silence pressed around him, thick and unbroken. For a moment he closed his eyes, hoping the darkness behind his eyelids would swallow the war still echoing inside his head. Instead it sharpened, and he saw again the luminous diagrams that his supervisors had forced into being, the impossible equations scratched across blackboards at 2 in the morning, the faces of men who had vanished from labs after speaking too freely. He lived with the persistent sensation that something he had participated in lingered just beyond the boundary of memory, a shadowed fragment no one should ever see again. At night, when the shifting winds rattled the shattered windows, he pulled from the satchel a sketchbook, its edges frayed from years of use. The pages were dense with graphite, filled not with equations but with images drawn by a hand that trembled each time charcoal touched paper. Many showed mechanical shapes, rising like silhouettes against vague, undefined landscapes. Others depicted biological forms distorted beyond recognition, shapes stitched together through anatomy that obeyed rules known only to him. Some pages were nearly blank, except for cryptic strokes, as if he had started to draw something but recoiled from completing it. The sketchbook was not a record of his work. It was a confession written in images, a catalogue of what haunted him. He never allowed himself to look at it for long. Each time he turned a page, he hesitated, fearing what he himself had placed within. For reasons he could not articulate, this collection of images felt more dangerous than any document he had destroyed in the final days of the collapse. He stayed in the monastery for 6 days, moving like a shadow through its ancient corridors. At times he heard distant motors, American trucks laboring through the mountain roads, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they reached this place. He prepared himself to surrender, rehearsing the words he would use, deciding which truths he would reveal, and which he would bury forever beneath silence. Yet even that plan gave him no comfort. Surrender meant questions. Questions meant scrutiny. Somewhere in the deepest part of his mind, he feared not interrogation by Allied forces, but the possibility that something he had unleashed or envisioned might be found within him. During the third night, as the wind intensified and dust spiraled through the fractured stone, he descended into the lower chambers of the monastery. He had avoided them until then, sensing an unease coiled within the underground spaces. The stairwell was narrow and steep. His lantern flickered, illuminating walls damp with cold moisture. When he reached the bottom, he found a corridor ending in a small chapel whose altar had collapsed under the weight of debris. Scattered around the overturned stones were remnants of manuscripts, their ink blurred by water. On the far wall, someone had painted a symbol in dark pigment long ago, a circle cleaved by a vertical stroke. It resembled diagrams he had once drawn while trying to explain a concept his superiors had called visionary. Seeing it here, painted by a monk centuries before the war, unsettled him so deeply that his breath shortened. The coincidence was impossible. No one outside his research group had ever seen such forms. And yet here it was, echoing something that should never have existed prior to his lifetime. He stumbled back, gripping the lantern. The realization that the symbol predated his work shattered something in him. Perhaps his research had not been an invention at all. Perhaps it had been a rediscovery. Perhaps he had been guided unconsciously by patterns older than any ideology, older than the institutions that had claimed his mind. He left the cellar abruptly, climbing the steps with frantic urgency, his boots striking the stone in uneven rhythms. When he reached his chamber, he opened the sketchbook with trembling hands and searched through its pages for the earliest drawing he had ever made. On that page, drawn in faint graphite, was a similar circle cleaved by a downward stroke, a simple shape that he remembered sketching during a feverish night years earlier, long before any drafts or lab experiments had taken form. He stared at it for a long moment, trying to convince himself that the resemblance was accidental. Here, before we proceed deeper into the unraveling of Dr. Voss and the mystery of his vanishing, I must ask you something in the very spirit of this unfolding darkness. From where are you watching this story take shape? Let your presence be known in the shadows, even as the past continues to close in. The nights grew colder, and with each passing hour he became more aware that he was no longer alone in the monastery. Footsteps echoed in distant hallways, too soft to be soldiers, too rhythmic to be wind. Twice he woke from uneasy sleep with the sense that someone had stood at the doorway, watching him. Each time he leapt up, lantern raised, but found nothing except dust drifting in the dim light. The feeling persisted nonetheless, an invisible presence drawing nearer. On the sixth night, unable to endure the silence any longer, he made the decision to walk out to the nearest Allied patrol and surrender. He packed his satchel, gripping the sketchbook tightly before slipping it inside. He stood for a moment in the moonlit hallway, listening to the hum of insects beyond the cracked window. Then he walked into the cold air, leaving the monastery doors ajar behind him. He was last seen at dawn by 2 American soldiers stationed along a forested ridge. They reported a thin man in a long coat emerging from the trees, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow but determined. He approached slowly, raising his hands to show he carried no weapon. They called out to him, instructed him to stop. He did. They asked his name. He answered with quiet clarity. They asked him to empty his satchel. He hesitated, and then, without explanation, he turned his head sharply toward the darkness behind him, as if someone had called his name from within the forest. One soldier later said the expression on his face was not fear, but recognition, like a man who had just seen a memory given shape. Before they could approach, he stepped backward into the trees. They shouted at him to halt. He continued to retreat, disappearing deeper into the shadows, and within moments, the forest swallowed him. A search party was assembled quickly, but found no trace of footprints, no disturbed branches, no torn fabric, nothing to suggest any direction he might have taken. It was as though he had walked into a void. The monastery was searched thoroughly. His chamber remained intact. The bed was unmade. His lantern still flickered weakly beside the window, but the satchel he had carried was no longer there. Only one item remained, a peeled fragment of graphite lying on the floor, as though torn from some invisible page. The officers concluded he must have fled intentionally, but the soldiers who had seen him disagreed. They insisted he had looked ready to surrender, that something had startled him, pulled him backward into a darkness they could not identify. Decades passed. His name dissolved from classified documents, and whatever files had once mentioned his research vanished during reorganizations within the post-war years. It was only in 2022, when a locked chest was uncovered during renovations of a farmhouse outside Mettenwald, that his presence re-entered historical record. The chest contained a single object, wrapped in decayed cloth. A sketchbook. The same sketchbook he had carried with him as he walked into the forest on the morning of his disappearance. Many of the pages were stained with moisture, but the drawings within remained disturbingly intact. And before we venture into those pages in the next topic, before we open the door to the final days of a man who should never have existed, and a book that should never have survived, allow this shadowed moment to serve as a whisper. If this descent into vanished history draws you deeper, let your presence linger by subscribing, so the darkness may continue its quiet approach. The farmhouse where the sketchbook emerged had been empty for decades, its walls bearing the layered stains of years without voices. It stood at the edge of Mittenwald, where the Bavarian Alps rise like frozen waves, silent and unforgiving. When the renovation began, the workers expected to find nothing more than rotted timber and dust. Yet beneath the floorboards of the lowest room, sealed inside a rusting metal chest, they found something that had resisted both decay and time. The air inside the box carried a smell of oil, graphite, and mold. At first they thought it was merely a book of drawings left by some forgotten artist. But as one of the workers flipped through the brittle pages, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. The sketches pulsed with a strange vitality, as though the shapes themselves resisted being observed. The faces within the drawings were unfinished, blurred, and yet disturbingly expressive, as if they had been drawn by someone who remembered them too vividly to render them completely. The chest also contained a single envelope, sealed with wax so old it crumbled at the touch. Inside was a folded page with words written in German, the handwriting dense and desperate. The ink had bled in places, but enough remained legible to be translated. If found, burn it. Do not look at the images. They are not mine anymore. No signature followed, just a symbol drawn at the bottom of the page, the same cleaved circle that had appeared centuries earlier in the monastery's chapel. The workers, unsettled by the tone of the message, handed everything over to the property owner, who in turn contacted the local museum authority. The curator, a woman named Dr. Anja Keller, arrived 2 days later, unaware that she was about to become entangled in one of the most disturbing rediscoveries of post-war Europe. Dr. Keller had devoted her career to reconstructing the fates of scientists who had vanished during the final collapse of the Reich. She specialized in lost archives, half-destroyed correspondences, names that appeared once in records and were never seen again. When she opened the chest herself, she immediately recognized the quality of the paper. It was the type issued to researchers in government laboratories during the early 1940s, rationed and stamped for classified work. But what caught her attention was the drawing style. Technical, yet possessed of a feverish energy she had never seen in scientific notebooks. It was art driven by obsession, geometry corrupted by emotion. As she turned the pages, she felt as though she were peering not into history, but into the interior of someone's mind during its slow collapse. Over the next few weeks, the sketchbook was transported to a controlled archive in Munich. Conservators worked to stabilize the fragile pages, while Dr. Keller began documenting each drawing. She assigned them catalog numbers, recorded measurements, and entered them into a digital database. But the process did not follow normal rhythm. The images resisted categorization. Many of them seemed to depict real structures, laboratory rooms, tunnel entrances, massive concrete foundations, but warped by distortions that made them appear dreamlike. One sketch showed a group of men gathered around a cylindrical chamber, with cables radiating outward like roots. Their faces were erased, leaving only shadows where eyes should have been. Another drawing portrayed a vast underground hall, illuminated by an impossible light source, the walls covered in markings identical to the symbol found in the monastery. As she studied them late at night under sterile light, Keller began to feel the same sense of displacement that the soldiers must have felt when Voss vanished into the forest. The drawings were not only historical artifacts. They were echoes of something that had not yet finished happening. She began researching Dr. Albrecht Voss, expecting to find little beyond speculation. Yet the deeper she looked, the more inconsistencies she discovered. Officially, there was no record of his birth or death, but scattered throughout Allied intelligence files were references to a physicist under various aliases, all linked to a classified initiative known only as Project Nadir. The purpose of this project was never clarified, but fragments of correspondence suggested it involved energy thresholds and perceptual mapping, phrases that made no sense in the context of wartime physics. There were notes from interrogations of captured German officers mentioning the man who sees the other side, and in one surviving report from 1945, a witness described a scientist who had disappeared before surrender. The date matched Voss's last sighting. Dr. Keller compiled these pieces like bones from an unearthed skeleton, and soon she began to believe that Voss had been engaged in something far beyond conventional research. The idea that a man could vanish so completely, leaving behind only a book of sketches and a warning to destroy it, fascinated her. She found herself visiting the archive at night, when the building was empty, unlocking the climate-controlled chamber and staring at the pages in silence. Under dim light, the graphite shimmered faintly, as though the pressure of his hand still lived within the paper. She began to dream about the drawings. In one recurring vision, she stood in a vast tunnel and heard faint mechanical humming. When she awoke, she could still hear the sound fading behind her eyes. Weeks later, she discovered something hidden in the spine of the sketchbook, a thin strip of metal, barely visible between the binding threads, engraved with coordinates. They pointed to a remote forested region near the Austrian border, the same area where Voss had last been seen in 1945. Keller hesitated before reporting the finding to her institution. The logical step would have been to contact authorities or collaborate with local historians. Instead, she decided to investigate privately. Perhaps it was professional pride, or perhaps something subtler. the sense that she was being invited. She arranged a field trip under the pretext of surveying post-war ruins, bringing only a graduate assistant and minimal equipment. The closer they drove toward the coordinates, the more the landscape seemed to absorb sound. The forests were dense, the paths overgrown. GPS failed intermittently. The locals spoke reluctantly about that area, calling it Der Schweigende Wald, the silent forest. They reached the location by late afternoon. At first, there was nothing, just scattered stones and roots tangled over rusted fragments of metal. But after hours of searching, her assistant found a depression in the ground, a kind of collapsed entrance hidden beneath moss and soil. It appeared to lead into an underground structure. Keller felt the air emanating from it, cold, stale, but unmistakably artificial. They unearthed part of the entrance, revealing concrete edges. She realized with a quiet shock that one of Voss's sketches had shown this exact structure from the same angle, though drawn decades before it was discovered. The assistant wanted to return the next day with safety gear, but Keller insisted on looking inside immediately. They lowered a flashlight into the darkness. The beam struck a metallic surface below, and in the brief flicker before the light failed, Keller saw a marking painted on the wall, the cleaved circle again, this time surrounded by a pattern of smaller shapes resembling eyes. The flashlight went out. The silence deepened. Keller could hear her own breathing, loud and unsteady. Then faintly, a sound rose from below, a rhythmic pulse, mechanical but irregular, like a heartbeat built from machinery. It lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. When they retreated to the car, neither spoke. The assistant quit the project the next morning and refused to answer calls afterward. Keller returned alone several days later, drawn by something she couldn't define. She documented the site extensively, taking photographs and samples, but most of her notes from that period were incoherent. She wrote of voices from the graphite, figures within the drawings, shifting positions, and the sense that the book is watching. Her superiors at the museum grew concerned when she failed to attend scheduled briefings. By the time they visited her office, it was empty. On her desk lay the sketchbook, closed. Next to it was a small recorder containing her final dictated note. He didn't vanish into the forest. The forest was only the doorway. The recording ended abruptly with the sound of static, followed by a faint hum identical to the one she had described in her dreams. The investigation into her disappearance yielded nothing. Search teams scoured the silent forest for weeks. They found her car abandoned near the dirt road, the driver's side door open, no footprints leading away. Just as with Voss, the trail ended as if consumed by the air itself. Some say the sketchbook was reclaimed by authorities and sealed once more in a classified archive. Others insist it was stolen from the museum before the officials arrived, that it now circulates in the private collections of those who trade in forbidden relics. But every few years, rumors surface of individuals who claim to have seen the drawings. Descriptions always the same: the warped halls, the blind faces, the impossible light underground, and in every case, those who study them too long report the same recurring dream. The hum in the dark, the circle with the stroke descending through it, and the sensation that someone unseen is sketching them in return. And as this shadow of history thickens, if you find yourself drawn into the cold logic of this disappearance, into the weight of what has resurfaced from beneath 70 years of silence, let your curiosity follow the darkness. Like this story, it goes deeper still. Subscribe and stay close. The next page will open soon. When the authorities finally acknowledged Dr. Anya Keller's disappearance, it was already too late to piece together the chain of events that had unfolded in those last days of her investigation. The press reported her as another missing researcher, another academic swallowed by an accident in the mountains, perhaps fallen into one of the many forgotten tunnels left behind by the war. Yet those who had known her personally, colleagues, archivists, and even the few workers who had helped uncover the chest, all spoke of an unexplainable tension that lingered around her office in the weeks before she vanished. The smell of graphite seemed to cling to her clothes, and once a night guard claimed to have seen light seeping from under her door long after the building had been locked. No one could explain why her digital notes disappeared from the museum's servers the night she went missing, or why every photograph she had taken of the Silent Forest site showed faint distortions around the same section of the frame, as though the light itself refused to settle there. After her disappearance, the sketchbook was sealed in a reinforced case, and the remaining files relating to Voss were transferred to a special branch of the Federal Archives in Berlin. Access was restricted, and even the curators were forbidden to discuss its contents. But secrets, especially those that carry the weight of myth, never remain buried. Within a few months, the story had already begun to spread through underground forums devoted to lost wartime research and occult technologies. Someone claimed to have intercepted a classified catalog entry confirming that the artifact was being held under the label Nadir 44V, and that 2 pages from the book had been removed for separate analysis. It was said that during that process, one technician collapsed without warning, murmuring a sequence of numbers before losing consciousness. Another refused to work in the same room afterward, claiming he had heard faint scratching sounds inside the sealed case, like a pencil moving across paper. By 2023, fragments of Keller's research began leaking onto the digital underworld. Blurred scans of the drawings, transcribed notes, whispers of what she might have found beneath the forest. Most were hoaxes, but a few bore the unmistakable fingerprints of authenticity. The sketches were more disturbing in digital form, because the distortion of compression made the graphite lines flicker as if alive. Those who stared long enough began to notice shapes emerging from the noise, outlines of faces that hadn't been there moments earlier, symbols rearranging themselves between refreshes. A myth took hold, that the images were not static, but reactive, changing subtly according to the observer. No one could prove it, but enough anomalies occurred to make the idea difficult to dismiss. In the summer of that same year, a journalist named Eric Brandt, known for his documentaries on historical conspiracies, decided to follow the trail Keller had left behind. He obtained access to her surviving notes through a contact at the museum. Photocopies of her handwritten translations of the warning note, sketches of the circle symbol, and a fragment of the coordinates she had recorded. Brandt was not a historian, but a storyteller, drawn to the spaces where history and nightmare overlap. He saw in Keller's disappearance not just a mystery, but an opportunity to expose the dark legacy of Nazi science that had never been fully exhumed. He began by retracing her steps, starting from the farmhouse where the sketchbook had been discovered. The house was still empty, still stained with the same smell of damp wood. Brandt interviewed the workers who had opened the chest. They remembered the strange cold that had filled the room, and one of them confessed he had suffered recurring headaches ever since, always accompanied by a faint hum that no doctor could explain. Brandt recorded every testimony, each word echoing in the hollow rooms. He followed Keller's notes next, driving toward the forest near the Austrian border, filming his progress for what he intended to be a short investigative piece. Yet as he approached the region known as the Silent Forest, his footage grew increasingly erratic. In his raw recordings, later recovered from his abandoned equipment, the camera would stutter inexplicably, freezing for fractions of a second whenever the lens turned toward the trees. Locals he interviewed warned him to stay away from the interior of the forest after dusk. They spoke of sounds that came from underground, of light without source, of animals found disoriented with their eyes clouded white. They said the place was cursed, though they used a different word, verschluckt, swallowed. Brandt ignored the warnings. He pressed deeper, guided by the coordinates Keller had written in her notes. When he reached the site, he found the same depression she had described, the faint trace of an entrance hidden beneath earth and moss. He spoke into his camera, describing the location with excitement and unease. Then, in the last minutes of his recording, he turned the lens toward the entrance and froze. The footage ends with the sound of wind and a sharp intake of breath. The final frame shows him stepping forward, the edge of the opening visible beneath his boots, then static. 3 days later, hikers found Brandt's camera lodged between rocks at the edge of the forest road. There was no sign of him, no tracks leading away. The authorities concluded he had likely fallen into one of the abandoned tunnels left by wartime construction and been buried by a collapse. But those who watched his recovered footage noticed something else. In several frames, faint outlines appeared in the darkness beyond the entrance. Shapes that seemed human, but elongated, their proportions wrong. And in one still, visible for only a fraction of a second, the light from his camera reflected off what appeared to be a metallic surface deep below. Etched into it was the circle with the descending line. As rumors of the footage spread, the story of Voss, Keller, and Brandt fused into one continuous thread, a chain of vanishings stretching from the war to the present day. Online communities began calling the phenomenon the nadir pattern, claiming that every 30 to 40 years, someone connected to the research resurfaces briefly before disappearing again. The pattern, they said, followed an internal rhythm, like the ticking of a clock buried beneath history. Most dismissed it as internet mythology, but others began noticing smaller incidents. Files missing from archives, strange interference in recordings made near Mittenwald, and anonymous posts signed only with the symbol that had haunted every stage of the story. In one of the most chilling developments, an anonymous user uploaded what they claimed was an untouched scan of the first page of the sketchbook. It depicted a circular structure, not mechanical but organic, resembling both an eye and a wound. Around its perimeter were hundreds of faint figures drawn so small they were invisible until magnified. Each appeared to be facing outward, as though guarding something inside the circle. The post vanished within hours, deleted by moderators, but mirrors began circulating across encrypted networks. Experts who analyzed the image noted that the texture of the graphite contained patterns consistent with modern digital noise, as though the image itself had been altered after scanning, or perhaps as though it had reacted to the process of digitization. Within the institutions that still kept official silence about the case, unease grew. Some archivists whispered that the artifact had been moved again, this time to an undisclosed underground repository. Others claimed that an unnamed research group had begun experimenting with spectral imaging on the drawings, attempting to reveal what lay beneath the visible layers of graphite. They reported strange results, markings that did not correspond to any known medium, geometric forms that seemed to extend beyond the edges of the page. One technician quit after stating that the shapes continued outside the boundaries of the image. as if the sketches described dimensions that could not fit within the paper's limits. At night, the guards assigned to the repository reported a faint humming echoing through the ventilation ducts, though all machines had been powered down. The frequency of the sound, when measured, was precisely 44 hertz, a number that appeared repeatedly in Voss's surviving notes from 1945, often next to the symbol of the cleaved circle. He had once written beside it, "This is the frequency of the threshold. Below it, the image begins to open." What that meant remained unknown. Those few who dared to read through his fragmentary equations found patterns that made no mathematical sense, as though they were not formulas at all, but instructions. Coordinates for something not physical but perceptual. Keller had hinted at this in one of her final recordings. He wasn't trying to build a weapon. He was trying to draw a doorway. And now, nearly 80 years after his disappearance, the doorway seemed to be opening again, not through technology or ritual, but through observation itself. Each new person who studied the sketches, who recorded their details, seemed to feed the phenomenon further, as if awareness were a key turning silently in a lock buried beneath time. The world outside continued, oblivious, while inside the archives a low vibration persisted, the sound of history trembling at the edge of revelation. Those who worked nearby described brief moments of disorientation, like losing a second of memory. Sometimes they found their own notes rearranged and handwriting that wasn't theirs between the lines, and occasionally one of them would glance at the sealed case and swear that the book had shifted position slightly, as though something inside it had moved while no one was watching. It is said that the symbol has begun appearing again, carved into benches near the museum where Keller once worked, etched into glass by unseen hands. And those who know the story look away when they see it, pretending it is coincidence, pretending the hum they sometimes hear beneath the static of old recordings is not calling their name. If you've followed the story this far, if the shadows of Dr. Voss and Dr. Keller still echo faintly through your mind, let their ghosts guide your hand. Subscribe, so you do not miss the moment when the next name vanishes into the dark. By the winter of 2024, the story of the sketchbook and its vanished keepers had begun to spread beyond the quiet corners of the internet and into the peripheries of legitimate academia. A conference on post-war German science at the University of Vienna included a discreet presentation by a physicist named Dr. Elias Kruger, who spoke briefly, almost reluctantly, of a hypothetical visual field experiment lost at the war's end, associated with a missing researcher named Voss. Most attendees thought it an academic curiosity, an urban legend dressed in historical vocabulary. Yet after the conference, Kruger was approached by two men who introduced themselves as representatives of a private historical foundation. They asked for copies of his presentation, offering generous funding for further research. When he inquired about the name of their institution, they smiled politely and said only that it specialized in unresolved wartime disappearances. Their eyes, Kruger later noted in his journal, carried a strange vacancy, the same detached calm he had seen in patients suffering from prolonged sensory deprivation. Within weeks, Kruger began receiving anonymous packages containing photocopies of what appeared to be original Voss diagrams. Some were stamped with wartime insignia, others unmarked. Alongside them came fragments of equations, hand-drawn renderings of machinery that seemed to blend organic and mechanical forms, cables like tendons, lenses shaped like eyes. The accompanying letters, written in a trembling hand, urged him to continue Voss's work, insisting that the threshold remains incomplete. At first he dismissed them as elaborate hoaxes, but one night, while reviewing the sketches beneath a magnifier, he noticed something that unsettled him to the core. Within the grain of the paper, beneath the graphite, faintly visible, were minute patterns resembling microfilm impressions, impossible to have existed in the 1940s and yet clearly embedded there. That discovery pulled him into obsession. He began analyzing the patterns under higher magnification, and what he saw convinced him that they contained encoded information, sequences of light and shadow that, when scanned, produced fluctuating digital noise across multiple wavelengths. He theorized that the sketches had somehow been imprinted with data, a kind of primitive optical code hidden inside the graphite layers. What terrified him was that the interference pattern, when converted into audio frequencies, produced a tone almost identical to the 44 Hz hum reported in earlier accounts. He played the sound late one evening in his laboratory, alone, recording its resonance across various surfaces. For approximately 7 minutes, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped sharply, the lights dimmed, and for a moment he felt an unmistakable shift in pressure, as if the air itself were inhaling. The recording captured nothing unusual, only static, but Kruger was never the same afterward. He began writing feverishly, filling notebooks with sketches of geometric tunnels and circles cleaved by descending lines. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. He spoke less, ate little, and complained of seeing movement in the corners of rooms, shadows that bent the wrong way, as if drawn by an unseen hand. 3 months later, his assistant found his office empty. His car remained parked outside, his computer left on, the monitor filled with hundreds of overlapping images of the symbol, repeated endlessly across the screen like a recursive mirror. On the wall above his desk, written in chalk, was a single phrase: "The drawing continues." When police searched his apartment, they found several pages from the original Voss sketchbook pinned to the walls. No one could explain how he had obtained them. The pages were darker than before, the graphite almost wet-looking, as though it had been recently applied. Forensic analysis later determined that the composition of the pigment had changed subtly. Traces of an organic compound had fused with the carbon, creating a substance not found in any known historical art material. Some theorized contamination. Others, privately, whispered that the material itself was evolving, feeding on contact, becoming something else entirely. By spring, stories began to surface of others who had encountered fragments of the same material. A museum conservator in Leipzig reported an unmarked envelope arriving in her office containing a torn piece of paper covered in graphite swirls. She examined it for less than a minute before sealing it away, claiming the lines moved slightly when the light shifted. The envelope and fragment vanished overnight. A technician in Munich described a similar incident, this time involving a package sent without return address, containing a USB drive labeled Voss 22. The drive held a single video file, 10 minutes of silent footage showing an empty room. In the corner of the frame, faint and intermittent, appeared the outline of the same symbol, pulsing slowly as though illuminated from within. The technician never returned to work. Authorities dismissed these reports publicly, but privately, the case was reopened under the Classification Historical Containment Inquiry 77B. Teams of analysts reviewed all surviving evidence. Keller's notes, Brandt's footage, Kruger's recordings, and attempted to trace the physical origin of the sketches. The chest from the farmhouse was found to contain traces of a resinous substance that did not match any known varnish or adhesive. Under electron microscopy, the resin revealed crystalline structures resembling nerve fibers. Scientists suggested contamination from surrounding organic material, but the resemblance was too precise, too deliberate. Someone, perhaps Voss himself, had sealed the book with a compound that imitated living tissue. As the investigation deepened, a pattern of geography emerged. Every major event connected to the sketchbook formed a precise alignment on the map, a narrow band stretching from the monastery ruins in Bavaria to the Austrian border. When plotted together, the locations formed an almost perfect line, and at its midpoint lay a mountain range known locally as Höllental, the Valley of Hell. Satellite imagery of the area revealed several irregular depressions, consistent with the collapse of underground structures. Military archives confirmed that in 1944, an experimental facility had been built there under the direction of the SS Technical Division. Its name, Stützpunkt WUF 44. No records of its purpose survived. Dig teams were sent to survey the area discreetly. What they found beneath the snow shocked even the hardened historians. Deep under the mountain, behind layers of concrete and rusted steel, they uncovered a chamber carved directly into the rock. Its walls were smooth, too precise for wartime tools. At the center of the floor was a circular platform engraved with the same symbol. Around it were metal frames that appeared designed to hold transparent panels, though whatever they had once contained was gone. Instruments were fused into the floor, their wiring grown brittle and blackened by age. The team found no remains, no personal effects, only a faint residue of graphite dust coating the machinery like ash. Radiation readings fluctuated unnaturally, spiking and fading as if responding to the movement of the observers. One of the engineers present, a man named Hauser, later confessed to hearing whispers while documenting the site. He claimed the voices spoke in German, repeating fragments of phrases he couldn't comprehend. When he returned to the surface, he found a small black smear on his hand that wouldn't wash off. Within days, he developed an infection that spread in branching patterns beneath the skin, resembling the very lines found in Voss's drawings. Medical reports recorded the case as unknown etiology, but the connection was quietly erased from official documents. The excavation was shut down within a week. The chamber was resealed, declared unstable, and placed under military restriction. But those who had been there, the archaeologists, the technicians, the soldiers, could not unsee what they had found. Some described dreams identical to Keller's, the endless tunnel, the humming, the sensation of being watched from beneath the earth. Others refused to speak at all. 2 of them vanished within months, leaving their apartments undisturbed, their possessions intact. On one of their desks lay a rough sketch of the circle symbol, drawn hastily in pencil, surrounded by smaller figures forming a spiral. It was at this point that speculation began to take a darker turn. Historians re-examined the surviving fragments of Voss's research and found that his wartime notes referenced not only physics, but perception itself. One document, translated from German, read, "Observation is the catalyst. To see is to activate. The image completes the circuit." If that statement were true, if merely viewing the drawings initiated some form of interaction, then perhaps everyone who had looked at them had become part of an experiment that had never truly ended. Somewhere within the sealed vaults of the archive, the sketchbook remains, dormant, perhaps, or waiting. The graphite lines, the trembling faces, the circles within circles, all preserved under glass and fluorescent light. But if the hum that once haunted its keepers still vibrates faintly through the walls, no one will admit it. The past, after all, is not meant to be awake. And yet the shadow persists, crawling silently across decades, binding every vanished name to the same pulse beneath the soil. The doorway is still there, patient, unfinished. If this story has reached you, if the hum has followed your thoughts even after the screen goes dark, leave a trace of yourself here, a sign, a comment, a flicker in the static, and follow deeper into the dark. Subscribe, so the silence won't be the only thing that answers when we descend again. By early 2025, the silence surrounding Stützpunkt FAP 44 had begun to crack. Someone within the containment program, no one knows who, leaked several still photographs taken during the final hours of the excavation before it was sealed. The images were dark, grainy, but what they revealed unsettled even seasoned analysts. In the center of one frame, lit only by the pale beam of a flashlight, a thin shadow appeared across the engraved platform. It did not belong to any of the visible personnel. It stretched in the wrong direction, away from the light, as though the darkness itself had decided to move. The metadata of the files indicated that the image had been captured at precisely 04:44 a.m., the same number that haunted every fragment of Voss's legacy. The leak spread through underground networks before being suppressed, but not before thousands of copies had already propagated beyond containment. Those who studied the images closely reported mild auditory hallucinations, a low hum just at the threshold of hearing. A few days later, one of the archivists responsible for classifying the files left a note on his desk before vanishing. It read simply, "He was right. The image observes." By then, the story of Dr. Voss and his sketchbook had ceased to be just a historical mystery. It had become an infection of the collective imagination, a modern myth evolving in real time. Journalists and conspiracy theorists scoured the Alps for traces of the silent forest. Live streamers camped near Mittenwald, hoping to hear the hum for themselves. Their broadcasts were filled with static, broken signals and moments where the video frames seemed to smear, as though the lens were recording more than it could process. The phenomenon was dismissed as atmospheric interference, but a handful of independent researchers noticed that the disruptions followed a rhythm, 44 cycles per second, repeating across every known recording. It was no longer a rumor hidden in archives. The threshold Voss had imagined was seeping into the present. A physicist in Oslo published a paper, quickly withdrawn, proposing that the frequency might correspond to a resonance of the human visual cortex, a bridge between light perception and brainwave synchronization. He suggested that repeated exposure to patterns matching the frequency could produce altered states of consciousness, even hallucinations. Within days, the article was scrubbed from all academic databases, though cached versions persisted. Those who read it in full were struck by one line near the end. If the observer becomes the observed, perception ceases to be passive. The act of seeing creates entry. No one could confirm whether he was referring to Voss's sketches, but the implication was clear. The human eye, when exposed to certain visual harmonics, might not simply witness the image. It might participate in it. Meanwhile, reports began emerging from small towns near the border. Locals described hearing faint machinery beneath the ground at night, vibrations traveling through the soil. One shepherd found a section of forest where the trees grew in perfect concentric circles around a patch of exposed stone engraved with half-erased markings. He took photographs, But when he tried to upload them, every file corrupted into pure static. Those who saw the corrupted data noticed that the noise pattern resembled a fingerprint, Voss's signature, hidden within the chaos. A private investigation team, funded anonymously, returned to the area late that spring. Their leader, a former intelligence officer named Dieter Hahn, claimed to have obtained coordinates that pinpointed a second facility buried deeper beneath the valley. Hahn's group carried body cameras and geophones to record subterranean activity. What they captured would later circulate as the Hullental recordings. In the footage, the team descends through a narrow crevasse, their lights flickering intermittently. At exactly 12 minutes in, a sound begins, a low hum, identical to the 44 Hz resonance. One of the team members whispers, "It's like it's breathing." The camera pans downward, revealing the outline of a metallic arch embedded in stone. It is shaped like an eye, the cleaved circle faintly visible on its surface. Then, the video glitches. For 6 frames, a human silhouette appears inside the archway, though none of the crew notice. After that moment, the feed collapses into static. The team never returned. Only the data stream remained, transmitted automatically to an off-site server. When recovered, the audio track at the end contained a voice, almost inaudible, speaking in Old German. "Nicht hinaus, schon innen." "Don't go out, you're already inside." Authorities denied the authenticity of the recordings, but their tone suggested unease. The silence that followed was absolute. By midsummer, the valley had been closed off under the pretext of geological instability. Satellite imagery of the area began showing anomalies, sections of the forest appearing slightly displaced, like the ground itself was folding inward. Some analysts claim the distortions matched the geometry of the sketches found in Voss's book, particularly those depicting spiral tunnels converging toward a single point of light. In one internal memo, later leaked, an unnamed official wrote, "Containment impossible. Observation breeds propagation." That same summer, reports of strange phenomena began to surface far beyond Germany. In Poland, a university archivist cataloging wartime records discovered a sealed box containing microfilm reels marked "Nadir." When projected, the images flickered rapidly, displaying hundreds of near-identical frames of the cleaved circle symbol. She experienced a seizure after viewing the film for less than 2 minutes. In France, a digital artist experimenting with AI-generated reconstructions of lost Nazi documents accidentally incorporated one of the leaked sketches into her data set. Within days, her computer began producing distorted images filled with eyes and circular motifs. She deleted everything, but when she rebooted the machine, the pattern reappeared on the desktop background, burned into the screen itself. "It wasn't an image anymore," she said later in an interview. "It was a presence." Even governments began to take notice. Classified reports circulated between European security agencies, warning of ideomotor contagion, a phenomenon where those exposed to specific visual stimuli unconsciously replicate the same patterns. In several cases, individuals who had viewed the leaked drawings began sketching them repeatedly without memory of doing so. Psychologists studying the effect described it as an echo of cognition, as if the drawings themselves were using human perception as a medium to reproduce. A memo from a German defense agency summarized it in a single chilling sentence: "The sketchbook draws back." Amid the growing paranoia, a researcher named Sophia Brenner, formerly one of Keller's graduate students, decided to confront the origins of the myth directly. She believed that the only way to understand the phenomenon was to locate Voss's original laboratory records. She spent months combing through wartime archives, tracking paper trails erased decades earlier. Eventually, she found a coded entry buried in a declassified U.S. intelligence file. It referenced a Dr. A. Voss and a transfer order for experimental materials to a facility in Switzerland in April 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. The order bore a handwritten note: subject en route, sketches secured, proceeding to threshold test. Brenner's heart stopped when she saw the coordinates. They pointed not to Bavaria, but to a region just across the border, deep within an abandoned hydroelectric station. When she arrived, accompanied only by a camera and a small research team, the building appeared long deserted. Yet inside, they found signs of recent disturbance: footprints in the dust, broken seals on rusted doors, faintly warm electrical equipment, despite the power having been disconnected for decades. In a lower chamber, they found a room lined with mirrors, each one fractured but still reflecting faint glimmers of light from an unseen source. On the floor lay a single object, a metal case, identical to the one from the farmhouse. Inside was a graphite-stained notebook, its pages mostly blank, except for a single phrase scrawled across the center in English: "It never stopped." That night, Brenner began hearing the hum. She described it in her notes as the sound of a machine waiting to remember itself. Her final recorded entry ended abruptly after she wrote, "I understand now. The sketches were not experiments. They were coordinates for what comes next." Neither she nor her team were ever seen again. In the months since, sightings of the symbol have multiplied, appearing on walls, on train cars, carved into desks of universities across Europe. Each appearance corresponds to a spike in reports of the hum, described identically across languages. Online forums now speak of the phenomenon not as myth, but as a form of awakening. They call it the re-emergence. They believe the sketches were never meant to stay hidden, that Voss's work, whatever it was, designed the threshold not to be found, but to find us. And perhaps that is what is happening now, the door slowly opening through stories, through screens, through the act of attention itself. Maybe every retelling brings it closer, every viewer another pulse in the frequency. You've seen the pattern now. You've felt the vibration between sentences, the resonance that hums beneath the silence of words. If the story has found you, let it know you're still here. Leave your trace, a light in the dark. Subscribe before the next page turns and the hum grows too loud to ignore. The final phase of the story unfolded quietly, without headlines, without acknowledgement, as though history itself conspired to bury what it had already allowed too much to surface. It began in late 2025, when seismic sensors along the Bavarian-Austrian border registered a series of rhythmic tremors, too regular to be natural. Each pulse lasted exactly 1 second. Each interval matched the 44 Hz resonance that had haunted every trace of the Voss legacy. Scientists attributed it to minor tectonic shifts, but those who had followed the case recognized the pattern immediately. The hum had moved beneath the ground, spreading like a vibration through stone. And then, for the first time in decades, the coordinates associated with Stützpunkt 44 lit up with electronic activity. A group of technicians maintaining a nearby communications tower reported interference unlike anything they had seen before. Their screens filled with static, interlaced by faint geometric shapes, circles within circles, and lines slicing through them in perfect symmetry. When they tried to record the data, the images rearranged themselves frame by frame, as though alive. Within hours, the system crashed, and the data vanished. but one technician had managed to print a single, still image before the blackout. It showed the same symbol, now altered. The vertical line had deepened into a black void stretching beyond the circle's base, like an opening. Something had changed. In the weeks that followed, strange atmospheric phenomena appeared over the Alps. Pilots reported halos of light forming low over the mountain ridges, rotating slowly against the wind. Locals described nights that seemed longer than they should have been, hours missing between dusk and dawn. In the nearby villages, electronic devices failed simultaneously at precise intervals. And through it all, the hum continued, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to rattle windows, always pulsing with the same relentless rhythm. People began to hear it even without instruments. It vibrated behind the bones, beneath thought. An international team was assembled to investigate, though its members operated under strict secrecy. Among them were physicists, linguists, and psychologists familiar with the earlier disappearances. They established a temporary base near Mittenwald, equipped with magnetic field sensors, deep-range microphones, and geophones to measure subsurface resonance. The recordings they collected were unlike anything in the known natural world. The data formed complex harmonic structures, as if the Earth itself were transmitting coded information. Spectrographic analysis revealed repeating intervals forming the pattern of the cleaved circle. When they inverted the frequency map, an image appeared, a rough but unmistakable likeness of a human face. The team continued, despite growing fear. On the 12th night of observation, the sensors registered a sudden increase in signal strength. The hum became a roar, shaking the entire facility. Every light flickered, every device emitted feedback. The sound was captured by one of the recorders, but the data ended abruptly mid-signal. The next morning, the facility was empty. The equipment remained untouched. Every logbook and personal item was still in place, but there were no footprints leading away, no signs of struggle. The official report cited evacuation under extreme environmental stress. Unofficially, those who later reviewed the recovered data claimed the final recording contained a whisper hidden within the noise, multiple overlapping voices repeating the same phrase in German. Wir sind gezeichnet. We are drawn. The disappearances marked the end of all sanctioned investigation. The area was declared permanently restricted, but the phenomenon did not stop at the mountains. Across Europe, isolated reports emerged. Low-frequency vibrations shaking apartment buildings, lights dimming in precise intervals, digital devices displaying the circle symbol for brief seconds before returning to normal. In one case, a journalist editing footage of an unrelated documentary found a frame that didn't belong, an image of the silent forest, though she had never filmed there. In the distance of that frame, a figure stood among the trees, blurred but human. Its head was bowed, as if sketching something on the ground. When she magnified the frame, she noticed graphite lines spreading outward from where the figure knelt, forming a perfect circle with a vertical line cutting through it. Then came the transmissions. Amateur radio operators across Europe began picking up signals at 44 hertz, faint at first, then rising in intensity. The pattern repeated like a coded message, but when slowed down and converted into audio, it revealed human speech buried beneath distortion. A single word repeated again and again. Threshold. Broadcasts from underground networks speculated that what Voss had built was never an experiment meant to open something external. It was a resonant system designed to teach human perception how to see the hidden structure behind reality, to train the eye to recognize the architecture of another layer, one that had always been there but filtered out by consciousness. The sketches, the hum, the disappearances, they were all part of the same recursive mechanism. The drawing had never been passive. It was an instrument. As the theory spread, the phenomenon intensified. More people began to hear the hum in recordings that should have been silent. Photographs taken near the Alps developed strange interference lines. Those who examined them closely claimed to see shapes within the static, figures partially formed, reaching toward the camera. In online communities, users began sharing their own sketches of the symbol, convinced it somehow connected them to whatever Voss had discovered. And yet, with every replication, the hum grew louder. Devices overheated, screens darkened, messages vanished seconds after being sent. It was as if the image itself rejected exposure, insisting on remaining half-hidden. In November 2025, a team of geophysicists conducting unrelated research in the region detected a final anomaly. Deep beneath the Höllental range, their instruments recorded an echo lasting nearly 2 hours. It began as a pulse, then evolved into a complex harmonic pattern consistent with human speech. When decoded, the sound resolved into layered voices, speaking in multiple languages, overlapping but synchronized. One phrase repeated distinctly in English. The drawing is complete. Moments later, the signal ended, and the tremors stopped. The silence that followed felt unnatural, a void that swallowed even the wind. Locals reported that the nights had grown still, the forest lifeless, as though the hum had drained sound itself from the air. Some claimed that in the exact moment the vibration ceased, they saw faint lights moving along the mountainside, slow, deliberate, descending one by one into the earth. No one followed. The following morning, the entrance to the valley had collapsed entirely. The ground was smooth, as if it had never been disturbed. In the years to come, historians will call it an unsolved mystery. Another ghost folded into the long shadow of the Second World War. They will speak of the missing scientist, the vanished researchers, the unexplained signals, but never of the deeper implication that perhaps the experiment succeeded long ago, and what we experience as the world is only the echo of something drawn elsewhere. The graphite lines are no longer confined to paper. They move beneath our awareness, connecting each observer to the next. The act of remembering keeps it alive. If you listen closely now, you might still hear it. The faint pulse beneath the static, the murmur that threads through power lines and digital noise. It is not a sound you hear with your ears, but with the marrow, the subtle vibration between perception and forgetting. That is where Voss went. That is where Keller followed. That is where the drawing leads. And if you have come this far, if you've felt the chill of those frequencies pressing against your thoughts, then you already know the hum does not end when the story does. Let it remember you. Leave your mark before the darkness fades. Like, comment, subscribe. So when the threshold opens again, your name will not be one of the lost, but one of the watchers who saw it coming.